So this DVD extra is going to be about numbers. And the numbers play a role. And the numbers tell a story. For example, you see that number, 4,138,349. That's the number of births in the United States in 2005. Which means the slightest change, a 1% change, impacts 40,000 births a year in the United States. That 18,884, that's the number of neonatal deaths, babies that died within the first 4 weeks of their life in the United States in 2005. That 1,248,815, that's the number of cesarean births in the United States in 2005. That 1% and that 1,318, you're going to have to watch for a while to see where they come in. But let's begin with the number 42. We'll start by looking at what's called the neonatal mortality rate. And the way it's calculated is the number of babies who die before 28 days over all births in the United States. So if you were to take that 18,884 we saw before and divide it by the 4 million births, you'd end up with a rate of 4.6 deaths per thousand. Now, how does that compare to other countries? Well, that's where the 42 comes in. Compared to other countries, the United States ranks 42nd in neonatal mortality rates. Critics of these rankings will cite two things. They'll say it's not fair to compare the United States to small, homogeneous countries, like the countries you see there in green. Countries like Andorra and San Marino all share one common facet. Nobody actually lives there. And if you took all of the births in all of the countries that are in green, added them up, it'd be smaller than the number of births we have in New Mexico in a given year. So they are small countries. So let's just look at countries that had at least 100,000 births. The second complaint, neonatal mortality itself is a difficult concept to look at cross-nationally. In some countries, a baby born at 21 weeks and who dies immediately is counted as a fetal death and isn't part of the neonatal mortality rate. In other countries, it is. And so what if we use the perinatal mortality rate? That's a measure that encompasses fetal deaths and early infant deaths. So let's combine these two things. Let's use the perinatal mortality rate and only look at countries with at least 100,000 births. Now, when you just look at the perinatal mortality rate for the United States in these 16 countries, you find that we're still not doing very well, 15th out of 16. Only France has a higher rate. If we look at countries with at least 300,000 births, we still don't do well. We go to 8th, but that's because there's only 9 countries. Not exactly a resounding victory for the United States. Now let's turn to maternal mortality. If we look at maternal mortality, that rate is based on 100,000 births because thankfully mothers rarely die in events related to either birth, pregnancy, or immediate postpartum. So how does the United States compare to the other countries on that? We're last, with a rate higher than any of the other industrialized countries. What's more problematic is that when you look at the rate for black non-Hispanic mothers, not only is it higher, it's several times higher, 6 and 7 times higher than the maternal mortality rate in other industrialized countries. The other criticism of these kinds of comparisons is the United States is bigger, more diverse, with a weaker social support system than exists in many of these other countries. It's also argued that the healthcare system is problematic with so many people uninsured, and that it's not a problem of maternity care, but it's a problem of the healthcare system that's at work. So let's do a best case scenario for the United States. Let's compare the United States to, again, those 16 countries that had 100,000 births, the 9 countries that had 300,000 births. And let's look at selected subgroups in the United States that should be at less risk. When we do that, initially, of course, the United States ranks poorly, 16th and 9th, as we've seen before. But what if we just looked at subgroups? For one, what if we just looked at mothers who began their prenatal care in the first trimester, which is what we theoretically want mothers to do? When you do that, the United States ranks still last. What if we just looked at white non-Hispanic mothers? Once again, the United States still ranks last. What if we look at white non-Hispanic native-born mothers and get away from the argument that this is in some way about those people, immigrants who have come in that weaken the rates in the United States? Well, the irony of this is native-born mothers actually have poorer outcomes than foreign-born mothers in the United States. And when we look at just white non-Hispanic native-born mothers, in fact, we don't do any better. Now, if we limit this, if we limit it to white non-Hispanic mothers who begin their prenatal care in the first trimester, you get a little bit of traction. We do a little bit better. We move up to 13th out of the 16 countries, 6th out of the 9 countries. So let's take an absolute best case scenario. What if we just looked at white, non-Hispanic mothers who are at least college educated? Now this is a pretty elite group. And when we do that, the ratings get better. But keep in mind, we're comparing this to the entire populations of other countries. And even in this best case scenario, the United States doesn't end up first. There's another disturbing finding here. This slide shows the most recent data that's come out of the National Center for Health Statistics. And it shows that the neonatal mortality rate actually went up slightly between 2004 and 2005. Now, it's not a huge increase. It's not a statistically significant increase. But in light of the next slide, you'll see how problematic it is. Because what it continues is a long-term trend for no change in the United States. Now, that may not seem like a big deal if the rate is really low. But again, let's compare it to our sister countries. And what we find is two things. First, for the other comparison countries, they both start with a much lower neonatal mortality rate and, through the 5-year period, decrease their rate by 16% at a time when the United States made no improvement. Let's put this in real terms. If we simply had the same neonatal mortality rate as these other industrialized countries, there'd be 8,000 fewer infant deaths in the United States, babies born within 28 days. Carry that over the 5-year period we're looking at, you could populate a small town and lives saved. And that's just doing as well as the other countries, not doing any better. Now let's look at trends in perinatal mortality. Once again, perinatal mortality rates, the United States fares a little bit better. The differences aren't as pronounced, and the perinatal mortality rate has gone down. It's a good thing. But again, other countries, comparable countries, started lower and decreased at a faster rate. They're still doing better. Now let's look at maternal mortality. And here the findings are most disturbing. Because while the rates in the other industrialized countries have gone down slightly through this period of time, the rates in the United States have gone up, and they've gone up dramatically. Now, part of this is a result of what they call case ascertainment. They're doing a better job of identifying maternal deaths linked to the pregnancy or childbirth period. But they have better case ascertainment in the other countries as well at this point. And to lay that all on measurement error is fallacious. It isn't true. Now, what's been the response to these troubling findings in the United States? Well, we have undergone rapid changes in the last decade. In this case, let's focus on the biggest one. And that's the overuse of a valuable intervention, cesarean section. Now, why do I call it a valuable intervention? Because it can be a life-saving operation when used appropriately. And probably the power of it is seen to some extent in this next slide. These are the rates in less developed countries, low-income countries, and you see they're tragically low. That's a reflection of the lack of resources in those countries to be able to address the real physical problems women are having. This next figure is a little bit complicated, but worth looking at. It illustrates the relationship between cesarean section rates and neonatal mortality in 3 different types of countries. In low-income countries, you see that red line, and that red line represents an increased cesarean section rate being related to a lower neonatal mortality rate. And that's not surprising. In those countries we saw earlier, if they can raise their cesarean section rate, they can address some of the tragic situations that occur because of their lack of resources. So that makes sense. The blue line represents middle-income countries. And that flat line suggests that regardless of the cesarean section rate in the country, the neonatal mortality rate isn't any better or worse. The green line is high-income countries, and the United States is in this cluster. And what it shows is actually a slightly positive relationship, not a powerful one, but a notable one. Because what we see here is that the higher the cesarean rate in those countries, the higher the neonatal mortality rate. Now, this isn't a simplistic one-to-one relationship, and it's not an overwhelmingly powerful relationship. But it does suggest that maybe there's a point in time at which more and more cesareans isn't helping, and potentially may even be hurting. The U.S. context is what we're going to pick up next. And here you see a slide that shows the cesarean section rate in the United States over the last 20 years. And what you see is this elaborate slope, a slow downward increase through the early part of the 1990s, followed by a rapid increase. And here's that 1,248,000 number we've talked about before. That represents the total number of cesareans. Here we put the United States in a comparative context. Again, our same 16 comparison countries. And here you see the United States is near the top in cesarean section rates. Not as high as Italy or South Korea, but very high rates nonetheless. Let's look at those over time to get a better sense of what's going on. This next slide illustrates 2 important things. First, that decrease we saw in the early 90s in the United States was relatively unique among industrialized countries. In almost every other industrialized countries, the rates went up consistently through the 1990s. They may have started from a lower base point, but they all went up. The other interesting thing comes at the very end of this slide, on the right-hand side. Because while the rates in the United States and Italy continue to go up very rapidly, several countries have initiated efforts to try to limit their cesarean sections. And it's had an impact, as cesarean rates have leveled in Finland, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. Now, to get a cesarean rate over 30%, you're going to have to start doing cesareans on lower-risk mothers. And that's where the cost-benefit issues start to become more important. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, there are risks associated with cesarean section. There's risks of complications of surgery, higher rates of infection that would be associated with any major surgery. On the other hand, if a mother or a baby are at great medical risk, then those risks clearly outweigh any problems that might be associated with the cesarean section. Okay, let's take it to the current situation. You still have those risks associated with cesarean section. They're still there. But now the mother doesn't have a countervailing risk. There's nothing else on the other side to weigh against that. So she now carries all of the risks of the surgery without the benefits to her or her baby. Are women the reason for the rising cesarean rate? Either because they're demanding cesareans or because of changes in the demographics of women in the United States? Well, let's look at some of those numbers again. This first slide looks at the rates of cesarean in 1996 and 2005 for women of different ages. In every single instance, the rate went up at about the same level, about 50% in every one of those groups. It wasn't a function of only older mothers having higher rates or only younger mothers having higher rates. The rates go up at the same rate among all groups. If we look at gestational age, how old was the baby when the baby was born? We see essentially the same thing. The rates go up in every single group. It's assumed by some that the rising cesarean rate is a function of upper middle class white women demanding their cesareans by appointment. When you look at the data, it shows a different picture. Now, back in the early 1990s, white mothers did have the highest cesarean rate, but what happened was that general trend, that general decline we've seen, was actually occurring among white mothers and among Hispanic mothers. But it didn't occur among black mothers. Their rates stayed the same through the early part of the 1990s. When the rates started to go up, they went up in all groups, to the point where the cesarean rate now for black mothers is the highest of any group in the country. Here we look at cesarean section rates by state. And what you see is strong regional patterns existing. Now, this suggests that this may well be about culture in certain areas and the way they approach cesarean sections. It can hardly be a reflection of evidence-based medicine being practiced at the same level in every single state. And it's been argued by some that mothers are driving this. So I was involved in a study with some others that looked at this by a unique source. We actually went out and asked mothers about whether or not they had requested a cesarean. It was a survey of 1,573 women from around the country. And we had two criteria to determine a maternal request cesarean. And I don't think this is an unfair test. One, a mother had to have requested the cesarean before she went into labor. Secondly, she had to have the cesarean for no medical indication. Of all of those women, there was one woman who met the criteria of both requesting her cesarean beforehand and having no medical reason for doing so. And she was a classic maternal request cesarean. Look at this quote. This mother believes she truly did the best thing for herself and her baby. So it's important to remember, maternal request cesareans are real, they are out there. But to think that a phenomenon as rare as this is driving a 50% increase in the cesarean rate is ludicrous. Equally important, people have started to do these studies in other countries as well, and they're finding the same thing. There are certainly some women who are requesting cesareans, but it is a small, small percentage and hardly driving the changes we see internationally. There's another twist to these findings. We asked mothers if they felt any pressure to have any interventions, and cesareans was one of them. And when we asked them about this, 9% of the mothers said they had felt some pressure to have a cesarean. But when we broke that down by the type of birth they had, an interesting finding emerged. Among those women who had had a cesarean, either a first-time cesarean or a repeat cesarean, 25% or 26%, about a quarter of all those women, said they'd felt pressure from their provider to have that cesarean. Even more telling, among those women who had a vaginal birth after cesarean, over a third of those mothers said they'd been pressured to have a cesarean birth. Now, the irony of all of this is that we begin with this premise that mothers are driving this, that mothers are requesting cesareans, and that's the reason for the increasing rate. In point of fact, when you look at it, they're under more pressure than their providers appear to be to have that cesarean. So, has maternal request cesarean increased the cesarean rate in the United States? The answer is pretty clearly no. But if that's not happening, then what's causing the changes? And I would argue it's practice changes. Changes in the nature of maternity care in the United States. So let me illustrate it with this next set of slides. What we're going to look at is a number of medical risk conditions that mothers have and their associated cesarean rates. In this first set, it's a number of conditions like diabetes and hypertension that are related to cesarean rates of less than 50%. Now, just for a second, let's look at that slide about the trend, and we see that decline in the early 90s followed by the rise in cesarean rates in the late 90s in the overall cesarean rate. Now let's look at the rates for these individual conditions in 1996 and again in 2005. What do we see? Look at the rates in 1996. For every single condition, the cesarean rate went down between 1991 and 1996. Now let's look at the present. When you do that, what you see is the rates went up for every single condition in this last decade. In other words, when there's a trend to reduce the cesarean rates generally, it isn't a function of any one condition, it's a function of all conditions. It's about practice. Let's look at the same comparison only for items that are more commonly associated with cesareans. Here we see it ranging from 60 to 75% cesarean rates. What happens in the early 90s? In every instance they go down. In the next decade, in every instance they go up. What's happening here is not a change in mothers. What's happening is this change in practice. Best captured by the title of an article I've always loved. It came out about a decade ago. It's a British article, a study of one hospital, and their conclusion was the rising cesarean section rate. Same indications, lower threshold. This is about practice changes. Now, this is captured about 90 years ago by J.W. Williams, the author of Williams Obstetrics, the biggest selling obstetrics textbook in history. He put it this way, and back then cesarean section was an emergency operation done only under the most dire circumstances. But he noted back then that it was increasing even at that point. Unfortunately, history shows that advances in the practice of medicine and surgery are rarely attained in a thoroughly rational manner, but that a period of undue enthusiasm or even almost reckless abuse usually precedes the establishment of the actual value of a given procedure. Now, he was talking about medicine in general, but he also spoke specifically about cesarean sections when he said, cesarean section requires only a few minutes of time and a modicum of operative experience, while vaginal birth often implies active mental exertion, many hours of patient observation, and frequently very considerable technical dexterity. Let's look at how mothers rate the maternity care system. Now, for all of the difficulties we've cited, it's important to remember mothers don't rate it that badly. They rate it better than they rate the U.S. healthcare system as a whole. So what accounts for this? These high levels of intervention, these poor outcomes, yet mothers feel like they're getting very good care. What could explain something like that? Who could be at the center of this? That's right, Vice President Dick Cheney, shown here in a loving pose with one of his grandchildren. In an excellent book, The 1% Doctrine, author Ron Suskind quotes Cheney as saying this about terrorism. If there's even a 1% chance of a terrorist act occurring, we must treat it as if it were a certainty. This is a perfect description of the philosophy of contemporary maternity care. Because when you set up a system that focuses on the 1% of problems that might occur, you undermine the care of the 99% of mothers who don't need those services. Finally, is there a new childbirth movement in the United States? There was great activism back in the 60s and 70s, and it seems to have waned in recent years. But of late, there's a couple of trends that suggest something might be happening. I know you remember back to the beginning of this DVD, one of the figures we put up was 1,318. And that represents the increase in home births in the United States in 2005. Now, that may not seem like a big number, and it's not. And it may be because of other things like measurement changes that occurred. But in the context of home birth data in the United States, it's the first time there's a serious increase since they've been keeping that data. So something may be happening. Equally important is the emergence of a number of books, articles, movies like this one and others that have focused on childbirth. So what can you do to take action? And keep in mind, we're not just talking about women here. Men can be involved in most of these things as well. Individually, Part of this is about knowing yourself and what shaped your own ideas about childbirth. Talk with care providers, families, and friends. Find out what their experiences were like. Try to develop a greater awareness of the range of possibilities available for women around childbirth. Resolve to connect with information sources, which are exploding in number, that might be able to give you more information about what's going on. At the local level, find out about your area's birth statistics. In most cases and in most parts of the country, these are published and available. And if they're not, raise questions as to why they're not available. Seek out local birth networks. These are small groups of women that have started around the country to raise issues in their own local areas about the nature of the birth experience there. Organize a tour of a local birthing center or a hospital to get a better sense of what opportunities there are for women in your area. Take an interest in pending legislation around birth. This sometimes involves the rights and privileges of midwives. It might involve birth centers. There's a number of issues that have actually gotten onto legislative agendas related to birth, and legislators want to hear from you. Advocate for what you believe in. Do a letter to the editor. Write an op-ed for the local paper. Set up your own blog. Participate in some of the blogs that are out there now. At the national level, here are some of the places people go to get more information. Check these out. Get a better sense of what's going on. Ask questions about how this national information applies to your own local area. Globally, there are more opportunities now than ever before to get a sense of what's happening in other countries. Take advantage of that to see what are the true ranges of options that are available to women around maternity care and childbirth.